Picture this. It's 1968 at Daytona International Speedway. NASCAR officials are crawling over every inch of Smokey Yunick's Chevelle, measuring, prodding, checking every specification against their rulebook. The fuel tank gets inspected, exactly 22 gallons, just like the rules demand. The officials nod, satisfied. What they don't know is that there's a fully inflated basketball inside that tank, taking up nearly 5 gallons of space. And in about 30 minutes, that basketball is going to disappear. This is the story of how one mechanic turned a piece of sports equipment into the most audacious cheating device in NASCAR history. Smokey Yunick wasn't just any mechanic. By 1968, he was already a legend, the kind of guy other crew chiefs studied like a textbook. He'd won the Indianapolis 500 as a mechanic, built cars that set land speed records. His garage in Daytona Beach had become the unofficial university for anyone who wanted to understand what made race cars fast. But here's the thing about Smokey. He didn't just want to win races. He wanted to outsmart everyone while doing it. To understand why a basketball ended up inside a NASCAR fuel tank, we need to travel back to the late 1960s. Stock car racing was exploding in popularity, but it was still rough around the edges. The France family had been trying to standardize NASCAR since 1948, creating rulebooks that grew thicker every year. By 1968, that rulebook was 50 pages of specifications, measurements, and restrictions. Every team was looking for the gray areas. But Smokey didn't look for gray areas. He painted them whatever color he wanted. The problem every NASCAR team faced in the 1960s was simple physics. More fuel meant more weight meant slower speeds. But running out of fuel meant losing the race. The math was brutal. At Daytona, cars were burning through a gallon every 4 miles. With a regulation 22-gallon tank, you could maybe stretch 88 miles if you babied the throttle. But nobody babies the throttle at Daytona. A typical 500-mile race meant at least 6 pit stops just for fuel. Each stop cost 20 to 25 seconds. That's 2.5 minutes spent sitting still while other cars are doing 180 miles per hour. Eliminate just one fuel stop, and you've got a massive advantage. NASCAR knew this. That's why they standardized fuel capacity at exactly 22 gallons. They'd check tank dimensions. They'd calculate volume. Some inspectors would even pour in exactly 22 gallons of fuel to verify capacity. They thought they had it locked down. Enter the basketball. Here's where it gets interesting. Smokey had built a fuel tank that was technically oversized. It could hold about 27 gallons. But before inspection, he'd stuff a regulation basketball inside and inflate it to exactly the right pressure. The basketball displaced roughly 5 gallons of volume. When the inspectors checked, they'd find a tank that held exactly 22 gallons. Perfect. Legal. By the book. The beauty was in the execution. After passing inspection, one of Smokey's crew members would reach through the fuel filler neck with a knife taped to a stick. Pop. The basketball deflates. They'd pull out the shredded rubber through the opening. Suddenly, that 22-gallon tank becomes 27 gallons. 5 extra gallons doesn't sound like much. But at Daytona, that's 20 extra miles of full-throttle racing. That's the difference between pitting on lap 44 and pitting on lap 49. In a sport where races are won by fractions of seconds, 20 miles is an eternity. The technical execution was meticulous. The basketball had to be exactly the right size. Too small and the tank would fail inspection, too large, and it wouldn't fit through the filler neck. The inflation pressure had to be precise. Too much, and the ball would be rigid, potentially damaging the tank's baffles. Too little, and it wouldn't displace enough fuel. Smokey even thought about the evidence. A deflated basketball pulled from a fuel tank would be soaked in gasoline, impossible to reinflate for demonstration. If anyone accused him, he could simply say, "Prove it." The evidence literally dissolved. But here's what really made this brilliant. It wasn't just about the extra fuel. Smokey understood that NASCAR inspectors were looking for specific things. They'd check for hidden fuel cells, auxiliary tanks, fuel lines that were too large. They had a checklist. Nobody's checklist included check for sporting goods in the fuel tank. This is what separated Smokey from other rule benders. He didn't just exploit loopholes, he created entirely new dimensions of cheating that regulators hadn't even imagined. The basketball trick was part of a larger fuel system manipulation. Smokey's fuel lines were 2 inches in diameter instead of the regulation half-inch. He'd coil 11 feet of this oversized line through the car, creating an additional 3 gallons of fuel capacity. The gas cap was hollowed out to hold an extra half-gallon. Even the frame rails were sealed and used as auxiliary fuel storage. All told, Smokey's cars could carry up to 35 gallons of fuel while appearing to meet the 22-gallon limit. That eliminated at least 1 pit stop per race, sometimes 2. NASCAR officials knew something was up. Smokey's cars would run impossibly long between fuel stops. They'd tear his vehicles apart after races, measuring everything, cutting things open, looking for the trick. They never found the basketball because by then it was just shredded rubber in a trash can somewhere. The psychological warfare was just as important as the technical innovation. Smokey wanted NASCAR inspectors to know he was cheating. He just didn't want them to know how. It drove them crazy. They'd spend hours on his car while other teams sailed through inspection. The more time they spent on Smokey, the less time they had for everyone else. One NASCAR inspector later admitted they'd literally lie awake at night trying to figure out Smokey's tricks. They'd dream about fuel tanks and basketballs and wake up wondering if they were going insane. The basketball trick worked for most of the 1968 season, but like all great cheats, it eventually got discovered. The story goes that a crew member from another team saw the deflated basketball being pulled from Smokey's tank and connected the dots. Word spread through the garage like wildfire. NASCAR's response was swift. New rules required fuel tanks to be filled and drained multiple times during inspection. Random post-race tank inspections became standard. They even started requiring teams to install inspection plates that allowed officials to look inside tanks. But Smokey just smiled. While NASCAR was busy writing rules about basketballs, he was already working on his next innovation, a car that appeared to be the regulation 7/8 scale, but was actually built at 15/16 scale, reducing aerodynamic drag by 8% while appearing completely legal. The basketball trick became legend, but it was never officially proven. NASCAR couldn't retroactively punish Smokey for something they couldn't prove happened. No rule explicitly banned sporting equipment from fuel tanks because nobody had thought to write one. By the time they did, Smokey had moved on to the next trick. This is what makes the basketball story so perfect. It wasn't just about gaining an advantage, it was about the mindset. While everyone else was reading the rulebook looking for what they could do, Smokey was reading it, looking for what it didn't say they couldn't do. The financial impact was significant. That extra fuel capacity was worth at least 1 position per race, often more. In 1968, the difference between first and second place at Daytona was $14,000. That's $110,000 in today's money. Over a season, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional prize money. But for Smokey, it was never really about the money. It was about the intellectual challenge. He once said, "All those other guys were cheating too. I was just better at it." The broader impact on NASCAR was profound. The basketball incident, along with Smokey's other innovations, forced NASCAR to fundamentally rethink their inspection process. They went from checking what they thought teams might do to trying to imagine what they couldn't imagine. The modern NASCAR inspection process, with its templates and laser measurements and computer modeling, exists because of guys like Smokey, who showed them what creative cheating really looked like. Think about the modern parallels. Today's Formula One teams spend millions on computational fluid dynamics to find hundredths of a second. They have entire departments dedicated to interpreting regulations. But in 1968, one guy with a basketball achieved more performance advantage than most modern teams could dream of. The technical evolution this spawned was remarkable. NASCAR started using more sophisticated measuring tools. They began requiring transparent fuel cells for some races. They instituted random inspections during practice, not just before races. The entire sport professionalized because one mechanic refused to play by the spirit of the rules. Other teams tried to replicate the basketball trick, but most failed. They'd use the wrong type of ball, a rubber bladder that would dissolve in gasoline, or a beach ball that would tear on the tank's internal baffles. Some tried foam blocks, but those would break apart and clog fuel lines. The basketball was perfect because it was designed to be inflated and deflated repeatedly. It was durable enough to survive inside a fuel tank, but soft enough not to damage anything. Smokey never patented the idea. When asked why, he said, "Patents are public record. Why tell everyone exactly how you're cheating? Better to let them wonder and waste their time trying to figure it out." The human element of this story is what makes it timeless. Picture the crew member whose job it was to deflate that basketball, the pressure of knowing that if you screwed up, if the knife slipped or the basketball got stuck, the whole scheme falls apart. The race is lost, hundreds of thousands of dollars gone, your job gone, all because you couldn't pop a basketball. Now imagine being the NASCAR inspector who finally figured it out. The moment when you realize you've been looking at an oversized fuel tank for months, measuring it, confirming it holds 22 gallons, never realizing there's a basketball inside. The embarrassment, the anger, the grudging respect. The engineering principle here was elegant. Don't modify the part they're inspecting, modify the inspection itself. The fuel tank was illegal, holding 27 gallons instead of 22. But during inspection, it wasn't the fuel tank being measured. It was the fuel tank plus basketball combination. That combination was perfectly legal. This kind of thinking would influence motorsports engineering for decades. Teams learned to think about the inspection process as part of the engineering challenge. How can we build something that's illegal when it matters, but legal when it's checked? Modern NASCAR has largely eliminated these kinds of tricks. Cars are now built from standardized templates. Fuel cells are specified parts from approved manufacturers. There's no room for basketballs or oversized lines or hollowed-out gas caps. But in a way, that makes Smokey's era more special. It was the Wild West of motorsports, when creativity mattered as much as cubic inches. The cultural impact extended beyond racing. Smokey's basketball trick became part of American folklore, a David versus Goliath story, where David used a basketball instead of a sling. It represented American ingenuity, the idea that with enough creativity, you could outsmart any system. Engineering students still study Smokey's innovations not for the cheating, but for the problem-solving approach. He'd identify the real constraint, not the rule, but the inspection of the rule. Then he'd engineer around that constraint. It's the same thinking that drives innovation in any field. What's the real problem? What assumptions is everyone making? What if those assumptions are wrong? Let's talk about what 5 gallons really meant in 1968 NASCAR. The engines were making about 600 horsepower, massive big blocks with compression ratios around 12.1. They were thirsty. At full throttle, they'd burn through fuel at about 0.25 gallons per mile. Smokey's extra 5 gallons translated to 20 additional miles at race pace. But here's the strategic genius. You didn't use those 20 miles all at once. You'd spread them across the race, running a lap or two longer each stint. While everyone else pitted on lap 44, you'd pit on lap 46. That doesn't sound like much, but those 2 laps let you pit under different conditions. Maybe you catch a caution flag others miss. Maybe you avoid traffic in the pits. Those small advantages compound over 500 miles. The risk was enormous. If NASCAR caught you, it wasn't just disqualification, it was suspension, fines, lifetime bans. Sponsors would flee, your reputation would be destroyed. But Smokey calculated that risk differently than others. He figured NASCAR needed him more than he needed them. He was one of the sport's biggest personalities, a draw for fans who came to see what he'd do next. He was right. Even when NASCAR suspected he was cheating, they rarely threw the book at him. They'd confiscate parts, levy small fines, wag their fingers, but they never banned him. He was too valuable to the show. The technical details of the basketball removal are fascinating. The knife had to be sharp enough to puncture the basketball, but not so sharp it might damage the tank's interior coating. The stick had to be long enough to reach the basketball, but flexible enough to maneuver through the filler neck. The whole operation had to be completed in minutes between inspection and race start, without attracting attention. Some reports suggest Smokey experimented with different basketball pressures for different tracks. At super speedways where fuel mileage was critical, maximum inflation for maximum extra capacity. At short tracks where handling mattered more than fuel, slightly less pressure to reduce weight. The basketball wasn't the only innovative material Smokey used. He'd pack dry ice in the fuel tank during qualifying. The dry ice would sublimate into CO2, cooling the fuel and making it denser. Denser fuel meant more energy per gallon, worth a few extra horsepower. By race time, the dry ice was gone, leaving no evidence. He'd also use magnetic particles in the oil. During inspection, magnets hidden in the oil pan would hold the particles, keeping the oil thin for better flow. Remove the magnets before the race. The particles distribute, the oil thickens for better protection. Undetectable unless you knew exactly what to look for. This was Smokey's real genius, using materials and methods from completely different fields. Who else would think to use sporting goods to cheat fuel capacity? Who else would use refrigeration techniques to gain horsepower? Who else would use magnetism to alter oil viscosity? Modern engineers talk about cross-pollination between fields. Smokey was doing it 50 years ago with a basketball and a fuel tank. The psychological profile of someone who'd attempt this is fascinating. You need supreme confidence, borderline arrogance. You need to believe you're smarter than everyone else in the room. But you also need the technical skill to back it up. Smokey had both in abundance. He'd been building and racing cars since the 1940s. He'd seen NASCAR evolve from moonshiners racing on beach sand to a professional sport with million-dollar sponsorships. He understood both the mechanical and political sides of racing. He knew exactly how far he could push before breaking. The basketball trick represents a perfect moment in motorsports history. Complex enough to work, simple enough to execute, clever enough to become legend. It couldn't happen today. Too many cameras, too much technology, too many rules. But in 1968, one man with a basketball could outsmart an entire sport. Think about the elegance of the solution. NASA was putting men on the moon with slide rules and basic computers. Smokey was gaining competitive advantage with equipment you could buy at any sporting goods store for $3. Both were engineering triumphs, just at different scales. The long-term impact on NASCAR's credibility was significant. Fans loved the outlaws like Smokey, but sponsors wanted legitimacy. NASCAR had to choose between entertainment and respectability. They chose respectability, instituting increasingly strict technical regulations that eliminated most creativity but ensured fair competition. Some argue NASCAR lost something essential when they regulated away the Smokies of the world. The sport became more professional but less interesting. Races became more about driver skill and team execution than engineering innovation. The basketball in the fuel tank represented the last gasp of racing's Wild West era. But Smokey's influence extends beyond his tricks. He mentored dozens of crew chiefs and engineers who went on to dominate NASCAR. They didn't use basketballs and fuel tanks, but they inherited his approach. Question everything, assume nothing, find advantages where others see limitations. The financial ecosystem around these innovations was complex. Smokey didn't work for a major team. He was an independent, building cars for whoever would pay. His reputation for innovation meant he could charge premium prices. Teams knew that hiring Smokey meant getting caught occasionally, but they also knew it meant winning races. The ethics are complicated. Was it cheating if the rulebook didn't explicitly ban it? Smokey argued he was just interpreting the rules creatively. NASCAR argued he was violating the spirit of fair competition. Fans didn't care, they just wanted to see spectacular racing and clever innovation. Modern motorsport still struggles with this balance. Formula One's Spirit of the Regulations clause tries to prevent Smokey-style creativity, but teams still push boundaries, finding microscopic advantages in aerodynamics and engine mapping. The game continues, just at a different level. The basketball trick also highlights how innovation happens. It's rarely a eureka moment. Smokey probably tried dozens of methods to increase fuel capacity before settling on the basketball. Each failure taught him something. The basketball was the solution that worked, but it was built on a foundation of solutions that didn't. Consider the supply chain. Smokey probably went through dozens of basketballs, testing different brands, different rubber compounds, different inflation valves. Somewhere, a sporting goods store clerk wondered why this mechanic kept buying basketballs but never seemed to play basketball. The knowledge transfer is important too. The basketball trick didn't die with Smokey, it evolved. Teams found other ways to manipulate fuel capacity. NASCAR found new ways to detect manipulation. The cat and mouse game continued, just with different cats and different mice. Let's talk about the actual race implications. With 5 extra gallons, Smokey's cars could run different strategies. They could push harder early, knowing they had fuel in reserve. They could gamble on fuel-only stops while others needed tires. They could run rich mixtures for more power without worrying about consumption. The data advantage was huge. Other teams would calculate fuel mileage based on 22-gallon tanks. Their math would be perfect, but their assumptions would be wrong. They'd make strategy calls based on flawed data. Meanwhile, Smokey knew exactly how much extra range he had. Weather played a role too. Hot days meant less dense air, better fuel mileage. Cold days meant denser air, worse mileage. But with 5 extra gallons, Smokey's cars could handle the variation. Others might run out of fuel on an unexpectedly cold day. Smokey's cars just kept running. The wear patterns were different too. Running longer stints meant tires degraded differently, brakes heated up more, engines ran longer at high temps. Smokey had to account for all of this, engineering the entire car around the assumption of longer runs between stops. This systematic approach is what separated Smokey from weekend hobbyists who might try similar tricks. He didn't just add fuel capacity, he re-engineered the entire race car system around that extra capacity. Cooling systems, brake ducts, tire pressures, everything was optimized for the longer stints. Modern data acquisition would have made the basketball trick impossible to hide. Today's NASCAR teams monitor fuel flow to the milliliter. They know exactly how much fuel is burned every lap, every corner, every straightaway. An extra 5 gallons would show up in the data immediately. But in 1968, data was gathered with stopwatches and clipboards. Fuel consumption was estimated, not measured. The basketball could hide in that uncertainty, just another variable in an equation with too many unknowns. The materials science is worth examining. A 1968 basketball was made from rubber and canvas, designed to withstand hundreds of pounds of force from players jumping and landing. That same durability made it perfect for surviving inside a fuel tank, where it would experience vibration, heat, and chemical exposure. Modern basketballs use synthetic materials that might dissolve in gasoline. The old rubber and canvas construction was accidentally perfect for Smokey's purposes. Sometimes innovation isn't about high-tech solutions, but about finding the right existing technology for a new application. The cultural moment matters too. 1968 was a year of rebellion and questioning authority. The Vietnam War, civil rights, student protests, everyone was challenging the system. Smokey's basketball was part of that larger cultural moment, a mechanical middle finger to authority. NASCAR's France family represented the establishment. Smokey represented the rebels. Fans chose sides. Some wanted clean racing with clear rules. Others wanted to see how far human ingenuity could push those rules. The basketball became a symbol of that divide. The international perspective is interesting. European racing had different approaches to regulation. Formula One used homologation, requiring manufacturers to build street versions of race cars. Sports car racing used equivalency formulas. NASCAR used spec regulations. Each approach created different opportunities for creative interpretation. Smokey's tricks wouldn't have worked in Formula One, where cars were weighed before and after races. But Formula One had its own tricks: flexible wings, blown diffusers, mass dampers. Every form of racing has its Smokey Yunicks, finding advantages where others see restrictions. The preservation angle matters too. Today, Smokey's cars are in museums, but they're restored to legal specifications. The oversized fuel tanks are gone, replaced with regulation units. The basketballs are nowhere to be found. History has been sanitized, the evidence of innovation erased in favor of pristine presentation. This raises questions about what we choose to preserve. Should museums show these cars as they actually raced, illegal modifications and all? Or should they show idealized versions that never actually competed? The basketball in the fuel tank is part of racing history, even if it's not part of the official record. The generational divide is stark. Old-time racers talk about Smokey with reverence, calling him the greatest mechanic who ever lived. Younger fans, raised on spec racing and standardized parts, sometimes can't understand why cheating would be celebrated. They see rules as sacred. The older generation saw rules as suggestions. But here's the thing. Both perspectives are valid. Racing needed to professionalize to survive and grow, but it lost something magical when it regulated away the Smokey Yunicks. The basketball in the fuel tank represents that lost magic, when one clever mechanic could outsmart an entire industry. The tools tell a story too. Smokey worked with hand tools and mechanical gauges. No computers, no simulation software, no CAD programs. Every modification was figured out with paper, pencil, and trial and error. The basketball trick was analog innovation in what was becoming a digital world. Modern teams spend millions on simulation software to find tiny advantages. Smokey found huge advantages with basketball that cost less than a sandwich. There's something beautiful about that simplicity, that accessibility. Anyone could attempt the basketball trick. Few could make it work. The risk management was crucial. Every illegal modification increased the chance of getting caught. But they also increased the chance of winning. Smokey calculated those odds constantly. The basketball was worth the risk because it was so hard to detect and so effective when it worked. Compare that to modern racing, where risk is managed by lawyers and compliance officers. Teams have entire departments dedicated to interpreting regulations. The romance is gone, replaced by bureaucracy. The basketball represents the last era when racing was more art than science. The competitive ecosystem was different too. In 1968, maybe a dozen teams had real chances to win races. Everyone else was just filling the field. Smokey's innovations let underfunded teams compete with factory operations. The basketball was an equalizer, democracy through creative cheating. Today's NASCAR has more parity, but less innovation. Any team can win with the right setup and strategy, but no team can gain the kind of advantage Smokey achieved with his basketball. The playing field is level, but boring. The basketball made it tilted, but exciting. Let's consider the counterfactual. What if NASCAR had never caught on to the basketball trick? How long could Smokey have run it? How many races would he have won? How would the sport have evolved differently? These questions are unanswerable, but fascinating. The butterfly effect is real. The basketball led to new inspection procedures. Those procedures led to new regulations. Those regulations led to spec racing. Spec racing led to closer competition, but less innovation. One basketball in 1968 shaped how we race in 2024. The human cost matters too. NASCAR inspectors who missed the basketball faced ridicule. They'd spent years learning to spot cheating, only to be outsmarted by a piece of sports equipment. Some never recovered their reputations. Smokey's innovation came at the cost of other people's careers. But Smokey would argue that was their problem, not his. His job was to win races. Their job was to catch cheaters. He did his job better than they did theirs. In the brutal meritocracy of racing, that's all that mattered. The technical evolution continued after the basketball. NASCAR mandated fuel cells from specific manufacturers. Then they required those manufacturers to build cells that couldn't be modified. Then they started sealing cells and checking the seals. Each step was a response to Smokey-style innovation. Modern fuel cells are marvels of engineering, bladders inside containers with foam baffles and check valves and rollover protection. They're safer and more standardized than anything from Smokey's era. But they're also boring, just another spec part that everyone runs identically. The knowledge management aspect is crucial. Smokey didn't write down the basketball trick. He didn't teach it in his famous Best Damn Garage in Town seminars. It was tribal knowledge, passed from mechanic to mechanic in whispered conversations. That's how racing's real innovations spread, not through textbooks, but through trust. Think about the courage it took to attempt this the first time. You're about to try something that's never been done, that could destroy your career if it goes wrong. You're betting everything on a basketball maintaining its integrity inside a fuel tank. The margin for error is zero. The consequences of failure are catastrophic. But Smokey tried it anyway, and it worked. And that success bred more innovation, more risk-taking, more pushing of boundaries. The basketball wasn't just about fuel capacity. It was about proving that creativity could still triumph over regulation. The modern parallels are everywhere. Tech companies finding loopholes in tax law, financial firms exploiting regulatory gaps, athletes pushing the boundaries of performance enhancement. The basketball in the fuel tank is the ancestral grandfather of all modern regulatory arbitrage. But there's a crucial difference. Smokey's cheating had style. It was clever and amusing and somehow honorable. He wasn't stealing money or endangering lives. He was playing a game, and playing it better than anyone else. The basketball was cheating elevated to art. The economic impact rippled through racing. Other teams had to innovate to keep up with Smokey. That innovation cost money. Budgets increased. Sponsorship became essential. The sport professionalized partly because one mechanic refused to follow rules. The basketball helped transform NASCAR from a regional curiosity to a national phenomenon. Consider the engineering elegance one more time. No electronics, no exotic materials, no complex mechanisms, just air pressure and rubber and human ingenuity. The basketball trick could have been invented in 1920 or 2020. It's timeless in its simplicity. That's what makes this story resonate across generations. It's not about the specific era or technology. It's about human creativity, finding ways around human rules. It's about David not just fighting Goliath, but making Goliath look foolish. It's about the eternal dance between regulation and innovation. The basketball in the fuel tank represents peak American ingenuity, not the kind that puts men on the moon or builds Silicon Valley unicorns. The other kind, the garage inventor, the shade tree mechanic, the guy who looks at rules and sees opportunities, that's Smokey Yunick. That's the basketball. That's America at its clever, rebellious best. Racing would never be the same after Smokey. The sport grew up, became respectable, made billions, but it lost the wild creativity that made legends. No modern crew chief will ever stuff a basketball in a fuel tank. The regulations won't allow it. The cameras would catch it. The data would reveal it. But somewhere, in some garage, someone is looking at a rulebook and thinking, what doesn't this say I can't do? They're following in Smokey's footsteps, finding new basketballs for new fuel tanks. The game continues, just with different players and different rules. That's the real legacy of the basketball trick. Not the extra fuel or the races won or the rules changed. It's the mindset, the belief that creativity can overcome any obstacle, the faith that one clever idea can beat million-dollar budgets and factory teams and computer simulations. Smokey Yunick died in 2001, but his basketball lives forever. Every time a racer finds a creative interpretation of the rules, that's Smokey's basketball. Every time an engineer solves a problem with elegant simplicity, that's Smokey's basketball. Every time David beats Goliath with cleverness instead of force, that's Smokey's basketball. The basketball in the fuel tank wasn't just about cheating. It was about the human spirit refusing to be contained by arbitrary limitations. It was about creativity triumphing over conformity. It was about one man with a crazy idea changing an entire sport. And that's why, more than 50 years later, we're still talking about a deflated basketball pulled from a fuel tank at Daytona. Because it represents something larger than racing. It represents the part of us that looks at rules and sees not boundaries, but beginnings. The part that refuses to accept because that's how it's done as an answer. Smokey's basketball reminds us that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or universities or corporate R&D departments. Sometimes it comes from a mechanic in a garage who looks at a fuel tank and a basketball and has an idea so crazy it just might work. What's your basketball? What rule are you accepting as absolute that might just be arbitrary? What limitation are you facing that creativity could overcome? That's the question Smokey's basketball asks us across the decades. The answer might not involve fuel tanks or racing or even breaking rules, but the principle remains. Question everything. Accept nothing as impossible. Find your basketball, because somewhere out there, there's a problem that everyone says can't be solved, a rule that everyone says can't be bent, a limitation that everyone says can't be overcome, and somewhere else there's someone with the creativity and courage to prove everyone wrong. In 1968, that someone was Smokey Yunick. The tool was a basketball. The result was legend. So here's to the rule breakers and the boundary pushers, the garage innovators and the creative interpreters, the ones who see regulations not as walls, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. Here's to everyone who's ever looked at an impossible problem and thought, what if I tried something completely insane? Here's to the basketball in the fuel tank. What legendary racing innovation do you think pushed the boundaries too far? Or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into racing's most creative cheating, hit that subscribe button for more stories of engineering rebels who refused to color inside the lines.